All right, so let's talk some more about In the Heat of the Night. And we're going to look at another scene here, and this time I'm just going to talk over the scene. And this is when we are in Endicott's greenhouse, right? And this is the point at which Endicott is sort of using the flowers as a metaphor for black people.
Have you a favorite, Mr. Tibbs?
Well, I am partial to any of the epiphytics.
Why, isn't that remarkable? That of all the orchids in this place, you should prefer the epiphytics. I wonder if you know why.
Maybe it would be helpful if you'd tell me.
Because, like the Negro, they need care and feeding and cultivating. And that takes time.
Now, what Endicott is doing here, aside from playing kind of a mind game with Tibbs, is he's repeating a kind of a standard conservative position about civil rights, right? That a lot of the more sort of politically conservatives, especially like the Republican Party at this time, felt that civil rights was moving too quickly, and that sort of black people essentially needed to be kind of nurtured into civil rights, and so that there was this idea that things were moving because things were moving too quickly, that there would be problems. And then here's sort of the real key part here, and I'm just going to kind of shut up and now let you watch this.
To ask you about Mr. Colbert.
Let me understand this. You two came here to question me?
Well, your attitudes, Mr. Endicott, your points of view are a matter of record. Some people, well, let us say the people who work for Mr. Colbert might reasonably regard you as the person least likely to mourn his passing. We were just trying to clarify some of the evidence. Was Mr. Colbert ever in this greenhouse, say last night, about midnight?
Gillespie. Yeah. You saw it.
I saw it.
Well, what are you going to do about it?
I don't know.
I'll remember that. There was a time when I could have had you shot.
In that scene at the end, there's this amazing little thing that Poitier does, a shrug of the shoulders, it's sort of this kind of act of defiance, right? So you have Endicott, who's kind of on the verge of tears, saying, there was a time when I could have had you killed, and everyone's sort of in utter disbelief. And I think Tibbs himself at sort of the initial moment is a bit shocked. It's almost like he just sort of reacts out of instinct. But once the deed is done, he doesn't shy away from it. He remains defiant, right? And again, it's a sort of, again, what might consider a black power position. Let's just look at the last bit again. Again, watch that shoulder shrug that Tibbs does.
There was a time when I could have had you shot.
As I've already pointed out, there's a huge tonal difference between In the Heat of the Night and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Even though they're both released in the same year, 1967, it's almost as if they're on the opposite ends of the decade. That is, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, both in terms of its style and its racial attitudes, feels more like an early 60s movie, whereas Heat of the Night is definitely a late 60s movie. Now this movie, Putney Swope, is one that was not assigned. You didn't have to watch it. But it is a really interesting movie that I think helps us understand some of the changes that's happening. And I just want to take a little minute or two to talk about it. The movie came out in 1969, so only 2 years after these movies that we've just seen. But it really, the difference between In the Heat of the Night and something like Putney Swope is just seems like a decade apart. It was also directed by Robert Downey Sr., yes, the father of Robert Downey Jr. Although actually, at the time he made this movie, and that's him that you're looking at, he was just known as Robert Downey because there was no Jr. yet. Um, and Putney Swope is a movie in which we see racial attitudes changing at kind of like this, at this amazing speed. That it features a character who, at the beginning of the movie, is kind of like an old 50s black character, and then sort of quickly turns into kind of this pro civil rights character, which quickly turns into this kind of militant black power character. And there's a sort of rapid transformation, and the sort of speed of the transformation is significant, and it's something that I'll be discussing in more detail sort of later in this lecture. Because I think to understand kind of what's going on in the United States at this time, it helps to understand, again, the pace of the culture. Now, so Putney Swope comes out in 1969, so we've moved 2 years from 67. And I want to move another 2 years to 1971 and the release of the film Shaft. And in terms of how Hollywood understood race, in terms of kind of racial consciousness in popular media, Shaft was kind of the next big step forward, right? And again, my point here is all this is made possible because of the changes that occurred in 1967 and the end of the production code. Now, Shaft is directed by a guy named Gordon Parks, who, of course, is also the guy who directed Superfly, the movie you were supposed to have seen. And here is a picture of Gordon Parks. Gordon Parks is actually just going to say a few things about him because he's definitely the godfather of this whole phenomenon that we call black exploitation, right? The black exploitation films. These films about urban life, a kind of gritty urban life. And even though actually to most people, he's best known as the director of movies like Shaft and Superfly, he's actually, in the art world, best respected for his photography. He's actually quite a famous photographer whose photos are exhibited in galleries all over the world. So when Shaft came out in 1971, again, it was quite a revelation. It was both a revelation and a revolution, in the sense that it was kind of perceived as the first truly black film, the first black film made for black people by a black director and black writer. And Shaft, the main character, John Shaft, is a detective who is kind of on the, he exists as part of the mainstream world of cops who are all white, but he's at the same time he's friendly with the criminal world, which is kind of the world of the black urban subculture. The next year, Gordon Parks takes this one step further by making Superfly. And when you think about it, Superfly is a pretty amazing film in the sense that the main character, Priest, is never on the right side of the law, right? He's basically a coke dealer. He's a pimp. He's someone who, granted, he wants to get out, and he's not a terrible person, but for the most part, he, unlike Shaft, who, again, is kind of a detective who is on the margins of the mainstream in that he does work with the police, Priest is just, a criminal through and through. And the cops are all bad. The cops, of course, are all corrupt. And even though Priest may be a criminal, at least, he's upfront about what he's doing, and there's kind of honesty about him. And this is like, again, the ultimate anti-hero, right? And, this is like sort of Gordon Parks saying, more than just like, well, see, look, this, black people can be just as good as white people, whatever, in the way that, like, we see John Prentice in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, right? This is more Gordon Parks saying, well, you know what? All the sort of definitions of what's good is irrelevant to black culture. It's irrelevant to us because, like the definition of good is always something that's created by whites for whites, and that the implication is that, for blacks to be good, they have to be more like white people. And so by creating this, outlandish, absurd character in Priest, Gordon Parks is just making a statement saying, he's taking the idea of the anti-hero to a whole nother level, to something that we hadn't seen before. Just in the same way that Walter Neff from Double Indemnity was kind of a new character, new anti-hero, to someone who is sort of committing horrible deeds that you also kind of root for. Here we have someone who's also committing terrible deeds that you root for. So let me talk about, again, this rapidly changing culture, and I think the best way to really understand this is probably through music and through fashion, or the fashion of music. Earlier I talked about the invention of youth culture and the birth of rock and roll. And of course, rock and roll is something that still young people listen to today. And yes, music today sounds different than it did 10 years ago, than it did 20 years ago. But those differences, I would argue, are very incremental. They're very small differences compared to the differences we can hear if you just go from 1964 to 1967, from 1967 to 1970. Think about that. 6 years, and there's a world of difference in terms of how quickly the music and the styles, the fashions are changing. So let's start with 1964. So here in 1964 we have the Beatles. And as wholesome as these guys might seem to us, we have to keep in mind that in 64 these guys are considered rather cutting edge. People, again, a lot of Americans were really shocked by the sort of crazy long hair that these guys had, right? And the way they would kind of sort of shake their heads, and even the music, again, by today's standards, obviously it's it's very saccharine, it's very kind of safe, but in the standards of 1964, this was something new, something kind of very different. Okay, so let's go 3 years forward, right? And this is only 3 years. And this is 67, the year that we've been talking about, the year of the birth of New Hollywood. And in terms of music, 67 is known as the Summer of Love, where the big, I guess what you call hippie bands from the 60s begin to emerge. And this, of course, is Jimi Hendrix, right? And again, think about, the sort of the way the people in this picture look, and how incredibly different that is from what we saw in the Beatles in '64, right? And in fact, the Beatles in '67 don't even look like the Beatles in '64, right? By the time '67 hits around, even the Beatles are looking like this. This isn't sort of some completely different culture of people. This is the same youth culture, but again, think about how radically, how quickly the fashion is changing here. Alright, then finally let's go 3 more years into 1970 and hear what music is like and what the fashion is like. So again, these are examples of how quickly the culture is changing. By contrast, I mean, let's look at something a little more contemporary, a little more current. I mean, if we go to 1985 and we have an iconic figure like Madonna, and she's sort of very typical of the kind of fashion as well as the music of her period. And then we jump to 2010. And today we have someone like this, right? I mean, have things really changed? Yes, the music sounds different, and yes, the fashions aren't exactly the same, but the differences are small. The differences are incremental. They are nowhere near as great as the differences we saw in the 6 years between the arrival of the Beatles in America in 1964 to the release of Black Sabbath's first album in 1970. Right? Again, there is such a huge, incredible speed at which the culture is moving, and that these movies really reflect it, as well as what's going on in the new Hollywood. And sort of to close this lecture, as well as basically close off the class, I'm just going to do just one more section and kind of talk about, well, go back to the past in order to see what the future was to hold.